Hey everybody, this is Javi, and you are listening to the Inner Child Collective, where you and your inner child heal for the better. Welcome. Thank you so much for being patient with me. I really appreciate it. It took me a while to get the groove as far as a podcast, and now I think I have it. So that's one of the reasons why I have some announcements for you. For one, I hope that everyone's doing all right. Before I even get to the announcements, I hope that everyone's doing all right. There's a lot going on politically. Also, we're going through 6 retrogrades right now. So, like, the world's a mess, So, if you are feeling the brunt of it as far as your shadows coming up, because Pluto is one of those planets that are in retrograde, there's also Mercury and a few other planets, of course, then just give yourself time to rest and rejuvenate this weekend if possible, because there's a lot going on, a whole hell of a lot going on right now. But moving on, I have some announcements for you. For one, the podcast, this podcast here will officially be officially be a non or a bi-weekly show. I don't even see Mercury retrograde. It'll be a bi-weekly show. For one, it will give me time to do research for the specific topics that we're talking about. It'll give me time to schedule guest appearances because I have a guest coming through shortly. Not on this episode, but in a future episode, and she's phenomenal. And I definitely want to have her, people like her, on the show. So it will give me time to schedule everything. If it's a bi-weekly show, it's a lot of work to research as well. Also, I do a lot outside of the show. I am writing a book. I am recording videos for YouTube. I'm writing essays. I work for my spiritual mentors company, Astral Scott Life Sculpting, as a resident psychic and intuitive. I read bedtime stories, so I do a lot. And I started taking like a week-long spiritual breaks or social media breaks for, to recharge. So there's a lot going on, and I just need time to like get everything together. And it just keeps me, it just keeps me from burning out. So that's why it's going to be a bi-weekly show from here on out. Also, I will no longer be giving messages on the show. I'll be putting those on YouTube as far as the inner child archetype readings or any messages pertaining to the inner child. I feel like that's supposed to be on YouTube, and I was also led to do that. Instead, we'll be doing Q&A sessions. So audience members will have the chance to ask me any questions about the inner child or anything pertaining to trauma or what have you. And you can send those questions to the theinnerchildcollective at gmail.com. Or if you follow me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, you have the chance to answer or ask any questions before the show. That will give me time to do any research around your questions too. So again, you can send your questions to my my email, theinnerchildcollective at gmail.com. And you can also follow me on, social media as well. So you can post those questions in the comment section if you have them, if you're following me, that is. So there you go. Those are the announcements. And so I guess it's time for us to start the show. And all right, let's get started. So this week, I would like to focus on trauma and how it affects the inner child. And the reason why this is very important is because we go through different types of trauma and have a lot of different ways of coping with that trauma, but we may not know the depth of it and how much it affected us, or if it affected us at all. So let's get started, to get a grasp on the concept of trauma and how it affects your inner child, which indeed affects your adult self. So trauma in a nutshell is basically like the psychological and emotional response to people, places, and situations that causes harm, and whether they meant to or not, or whether you meant to cause harm to yourself or not. But basically, that's what it is: a psychological and emotional response to people, places, and situations that causes harm. What I mean by intentional and unintentional, and the unintentional part is also very important because there are people who really do mean well, but don't know that they have caused us harm, don't know, that they have been triggered by something. So they may be causing you further trauma, and you may not know that. That's why it's so important to know know about your triggers and know about what's going on, because what ends up happening is that you may have a response, and there are people who may not know that they have been traumatized, or they don't know whether they've been triggered, because there are people who are very much deep in the trauma closet, right? They don't know. And so, how would you be able to combat that if you don't know? So, that's why I say unintentional. And why it's so important to understand your own trauma. So basically, again, it's a psychological and emotional response to people, places, and situations that cause us harm, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And there are three types of trauma according to the Department of Mental Health. There's the acute trauma, which occurs after an isolated incident, basically after, say, for instance, a car accident. Um, you got into a car accident when you were a child, and of course, it's an isolated incident, but now you're afraid to drive. That's the type of thing. That's acute trauma. That's an example. Then you have chronic trauma, which occurs after repeated and prolonged abuse. So basically, chronic trauma is being abused on a regular basis. And when you're a child, you're being abused, whether you are beaten or you are psychologically abused, sexually abused, whatnot. Is a prolonged thing, right? And so you have trauma responses as a result of that. That's what chronic trauma is. And then you have complex. A lot of us who have gone through trauma after trauma after trauma, and it's like various forms of trauma. That's why we have complex PTSD, and that's where that comes from. And that's when that occurs after being exposed to various and multiple traumatic events, often invasive and very impersonal in nature. Like, say, for instance, racism. Racial discrimination is a huge thing. On top of that, you're being discriminated against based on your other intersections. You could be poor. You could be, you can be going through bullying due to your weight, or bullying because of the religion you practice. And because of our intersections, we are more likely to go through various forms of abuse. So that's where complex trauma comes from. As a result of that, of us going through a lot of complex trauma or any sort of trauma, we end up developing coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms to shield us, or to help us cope with what happened, or to help us escape what happened. So, and this is really common among children who have been abused. Say, for instance, you start biting your nails, or you start sleeping with the lights on, because you've been sexually abused, or and you're afraid of your perpetrator coming into your room. If that's the case, some people keep their clothes on to keep their perpetrator from touching them. Speaking of touching, you may not want anyone to touch you because, you know, of being hit, or it reminded you, of the time where you were pushed somewhere. There's also you making up stories. Projection is another thing. Um, False storytelling is another thing. When you're making up all kinds of assumptions based on your trauma and the different things that you went through. Um, Promiscuity, drug use, um, substance abuse is a huge issue with people who have gone through trauma. Um, the list goes on. Okay, and there's just basically like a few of examples of, as far as coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms in regards to trauma, or to shield you away from the trauma. Um, and the reason why it's so important to know about your defense mechanisms or your coping mechanisms, because they play a huge part in the story that you have told yourself over the years, because of the trauma and because of what was going on with you during those times. Our brains have the capacity, the tendency, not the tendency, to use stories to protect us. We use a lot of our on a subconscious level. Um, it protects us from harm by shielding us from the worst of the abuse, which is why a lot of people tend to block out, or people black out, or they don't understand, or they don't know what happened to them. And it's also very important to know that not all of trauma involves abuse or violence or any sort of violence in nature. Like there's the big traumas and the little traumas. Now the big traumas are the ones that a lot of us go through. You know, discrimination, sexual abuse, um, financial abuse, physical, psychological abuse, religious and spiritual abuse. Those are the big traumas, right? Because our psychological or emotional response, um, for one, is very interpersonal in nature. Um, it deals with it is basically like a emotional, a psychological attack, and as a result of that, like a lot of our life is just like pretty much it centers around protecting ourselves from or coping with the aftermath of the abuse. So that's what the big traumas are, right? And it's like those are the ones I'm talking about. But there are also the little traumas. The little traumas, stage fright, you know, tripping and falling, thinking that you lost your parents when they really, you know, you get lost in the mall and you freaking out as a result. Now or an elevator, you know, or being trapped in an elevator. Those are little traumas, right? It's not about the incident itself. Your emotional and is about the emotional and psychological reaction to the trauma, whether it's a big trauma or a little trauma. It's not just about the incident itself. It's also about the trauma itself, or the magnitude of the trauma is also shaped by your perception of reality, or it shapes your perception of reality. As I said before, um, trauma has the tendency to make us write stories. And we use those stories to protect ourselves, regardless of whether it's real or imagined. I know for myself, I'll use myself for an example. I use a lot. I'm a storyteller. I'm an author. Um, and I also have like a complex trauma history, which involved me being abused on multiple occasions, in various occasions, and experiencing various forms of abuse. So as a result of all of that, I pretty much created the story that I just somehow deserved all that's happened to me. That I somehow did something to create these narratives. So as a reason, and not only did I do something to create those narratives, I'm constantly giving reasons of people, giving other people reasons not to pretty much deal with me, quote unquote. And this is a story that I have told myself for years. And this has been going on as a child, you know, since my childhood. So it shaped my perception of reality because on the subconscious level, I really believe this. So now, like, now that I think as if I'm feeling as if I have these emotions, and now I'm acting as if. So it took me years. I still struggle with this. It took me years to realize that I am capable of love. And I'm deserving of love. So there's a lot of unpacking, you know, that goes in with your perception of reality when it comes to trauma. And also you have your defense and coping mechanisms. Everyone copes. Everyone has certain coping mechanisms to soothe them or to help them calm down, especially when they're upset. But there's a difference between a healthy coping mechanism and a coping mechanism that is shaping your perception of reality in a way that is very unhealthy and very unhelpful for you as a person. Um, is it keeping you from seeing your reality for what it is? Is it keeping you from your own feelings and your own emotional state? Is it keeping you from truly regulating your emotions? Um, those are the questions that you are to ask yourself in regards to your coping and defense mechanisms. Because what what you do to soothe yourself may not be for your highest good. It may not be something that you can pretty much put down or overcome um, without either without doing shadow work, basically, without doing the shadow work necessary. So this is a time for you to ask about your coping mechanisms, because trauma, when you are soothing yourself from trauma or you're triggered in some way, shape, or form, your coping mechanism will help you determine or your reaction to reality. It will help you determine whether or not your coping mechanism or your defense mechanisms um, are holding you back or keeping you at a certain level where you're not able to see reality for what it is, or you're not able to see your own strength and divinity because of it. So that's something to think about when we're talking about like coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms. It's definitely not about the incident itself. It's about our reaction, our emotional, psychological reaction to it. Okay. And your coping mechanisms and your perception of reality, it shapes your trauma, like plays a huge part in that. So as far as like how trauma affects us as children, we're psychologically and emotionally vulnerable between the ages of 0 and 6, according to child psychology. During that time, we are sponges. We are not only like taking in everything that we have learned or are learning, but we're counting on these adults. We're counting on the outside world to teach us about how it is, how life is, how we're supposed to be living, how we're supposed to act. And around this time, like children, this is where our imagination is very, very strong. This is where our imagination, our sense of play, our sense of wonder is so prevalent. It We use that to understand and navigate through this world, and we have this this hope in the people who are around us, in the environments that we are a part of. And so what ends up happening is that when um, these adults that were supposed to be looking out for us are not able to provide us the answers that we are looking for, or they hurt us in some way, shape, or form, or they shape our perception by abusing us, or uh, abusing their authority with power and control. What ends up happening is that that becomes our truth. We internalize their messages, their negative messages about us as the truth. So by the time we're 6 years old, we pretty much have a good idea as to how our life is going to be like with these particular adults, and how the world is going to be like based on the perception that we've internalized based on the negative messages that we have received. Because we also have to realize that our parents have gone through the same thing. Whatever negative message they've had, within their subconscious mind, that came from someone else. That came from something else. And that's a whole nother episode altogether, as far as like how historical and generational trauma and how that came to be. It definitely stems from white supremacist ideologies around a lot of things, and we're very much indoctrinated and we're very much influenced by white supremacy, um, which causes a lot of trauma, which causes us which plays a huge part in how we view ourselves. That's a whole nother episode altogether, but I just wanted to let you know that is where a lot of the truth, the quote unquote truths, and the criticisms and the negative behavior towards you from your parents. That's what they came from. That's where that came from. So we are to have that in mind. So as a result of these negative messages that we have received as a child, they're now stored in our unconscious mind. And because our inner child is a whole separate entity altogether at this point, our perception of reality is changed. And depending on what type of trauma you have gone through, whether it be chronic, complex, or acute, it shapes who you are as a person. It shapes your reality. It shapes your DNA. It shapes even your brain chemistry. There is a such thing as a trauma brain. There, because what ends up happening is that our brain is very much shaped by our experiences because we're on high alert at all times. For real, like we're on a high alert at all times out of the mere fear of not being safe. So we are basically in a fight or flight mode. And so when we become adults, we end up acting as if our inner child ends up running us. Our inner child ends up, through us, they behave a certain way because now they feel like they have the freedom to be who they want to be or who they think they want to be. But what's happening is that it's the trauma that they have not healed from, that they're operating on that level, and so through you they are doing that. They're doing you, and they're doing that. And speaking of the nervous system, that's why our nervous system becomes extremely dysregulated. That's a trauma response, a biochemical trauma response. Our nervous system becomes dysregulated, and we're on high alert. Our perception of reality has changed because of these stories, and so now we're in defense mode, or we're afraid all the time, or we have. That's why a lot of us have anxiety. That's why a lot of us have depression. That's why a lot of us are having problems with promiscuity, or we have a problem with drug use, or we have an issue with trusting people. We have relationship issues. A lot of us are dealing with that because of a dysregulated nervous system. We're used to drama and trauma now. We're used to chaos now. A lot of us. So we look for that. We look for that, and from the world now, because we simply do not know any better. That's why a lot of us are asking ourselves, why are we like this? Well, that's why. A lot of us are like this because we fall into categories of three types of trauma. We fall into one of those categories. This is one of the reasons why a lot of us are not able to cope with reality or cope with real life as adults, because of our dysregulated nervous system. And on top of that, the trauma we've gone through, we have pretty much wore it as if it's a coat, because we believe in the stories that we have been told. So it's very much, it really is like a whole map of things. Like trauma, it just creates this map. Our experiences creates a map for us as far as how we're supposed to be acting, how we are as a human being. But we can unlearn that as well. Which is why it's so important as far as knowing your trauma. We are like, as I said before, one of the reasons why it's so important, it's so vital to know about your trauma and what type of trauma you are dealing with, is because it will help you understand your perception of reality and where it came from. What you feel about yourself and what you think about yourself simply isn't true in regards to the negativity. Those are someone else's messages. We are all storytellers in the grand scheme of things. We're all storytellers. We are all writing a story, whether it's written or it's an oral story, right? That's like words cast spells, and storytellers are magical. Every time you speak and paint a picture, it's like you in it's like you're reading or listening to a book. And so what ends up happening is that when we hear a story over and over and over again, we end up taking on those words and taking on those characters and the setting and the world building. We take it on as our own. And once we realize where those stories are coming from, and once we start decolonizing our minds, we start to unlearn those stories because we understand where they're coming from. So inner child energy work will help you to determine what part of the narrative is based in reality and was been influenced by the childhood trauma. Because think about it, like for real, how many times have we, when we were children, we actually we made up like some sort of scenario that doesn't make any sense. I remember, I have a story. Like I remember watching a YouTube video of two brothers. They were like the nerd fighters. I think they're called nerd fighters. And so there was a story where one of the brothers truly believed that the other like pooped in the Nintendo. He's saying, no, I did not do that. And he believed that for years. And finally he was like, as an adult, he realized how ridiculous and how gross that was. It's the same thing with trauma. We have the tendency to believe a lot of these narratives that are being told to us based on someone else's perception and based on someone else's perception, the perception of someone who really didn't do their own healing. So they're coping the best way they can, and they're reacting the way someone has reacted to them. And as a result of that, we picked up that story and we have all these narratives in our mind, these thoughts in our mind. And they're a cluster of stories, they're a cluster of thoughts that make up an entire story that has you looking like a whole villain. Right? So what ends up happening is that once you start doing inner child energy work, you start to realize that a lot of the stories, a lot of negativity and a lot of messages you receive are complete lies. They're a complete fabrication. And they're based on someone else's skewed perception of reality. So that's what ends up happening. Like, you start to realize what's based in reality and what's influenced by childhood trauma. It will also help you learn to forgive. Like, knowing about trauma will help you learn to forgive yourself and not knowing better. Excuse me. Most people with trauma histories hold guilt and shame over shit that they have done. Most of us have that notion that somehow there's something's wrong with us. It's not the truth. You start to let go of that guilt and that shame once you start doing the work. And you're coping, and if you were a toxic person at one point, you also have to understand that your behavior at the time was not set in stone. Those behavior and those coping mechanisms and those defense mechanisms were trauma responses, and they're not set in stone. And we have the power to change, but in order to do that, you have to understand what type of trauma you are dealing with and what magnitude it affected your life. And then when you start to dismantle and unlearn and tear away the pieces of the story and do a lot of work on the unconscious mind, you'll start to realize that you were responding to trauma. And once you start doing that, you will start to realize and forgive yourself. You'll begin to realize that and forgive yourself. Knowing about your trauma will also help you forgive and recover and connect or reconnect with your inner child. Many of us are angry with our inner child because they were being themselves. We were told a long time ago that it was not okay. As children, we were told that it wasn't okay to be ourselves. And so what ends up happening is that we end up being angry at our inner child and being angry at ourselves as children, because this is the reason, like I said, this is like, we really do believe that we deserve what happened to us. Because how dare we know our power as children? So once you start to learn that and start connecting with your inner child, you will start to realize that they've kept you alive. They are the reason why you're alive. If you're listening to this, you are alive because of your inner child. You are standing here right now listening to this. because of your inner child. And your inner child's resilient. They're very creative, they're very loving, they're very kind. They meant no harm. And what ends up happening is that you end up loving them because that's a part of you. You start to love that part of yourself. And so it would encourage you to reconnect with your divine energy as well. Like, we were all chosen by spirit and connected to the divine. We're all connected. Children especially, even more so because they're not tainted by the world between the ages of 0 and 6. That's where our imagination is at its height. So reconnecting and parenting, or connecting and reparenting your child, your inner child, will help you rediscover your divinity and that of your inner child. You'll be able to tap into energies, and you'll understand your intuition. You'll begin to play and reimagine a whole different world through play and through forgiving and through loving yourself. But it all starts with dismantling the unconscious mind and getting rid of the stories that were very toxic and pretty much added to your coping mechanisms, and your defense mechanisms and your perception of the world. And lastly, it will hold you and the people who hurt you accountable. A lot of us, we don't like to talk about this, but a lot of us are very toxic, and we're very toxic at one point. And when we don't talk about those things, we end up projecting a lot of our insecurities onto other people. And so we are to be aware of our toxic behavior, but know that it's not set in stone, and know that that is not what defines us. And that's another thing too. Our trauma doesn't define us. We can literally flip the script. We can literally rewrite our story. Literally, energetically and figuratively, and on an unconscious level, write our own story. Another one. It doesn't define us, or anything in that nature. So your toxic behavior was basically your inner child's basic needs not being met, and that's the same for the people who have hurt you. So when you come from it from that angle, you'll learn not to take things so personal, and you'll learn to dismantle a lot of those defense mechanisms and those coping mechanisms that you've always held on to. You're not the toxic. Your toxicity or your past toxic behavior does not define you. I seriously want you to understand that part. I really want you to understand that part, because a lot of folks who are doing this work, or who are in the thick of their emotions around certain things, they blame themselves for what happened, and even though it is your responsibility to heal from the trauma that you have gone through, it's not okay for you to beat yourself up or to see yourself as a trashy person. You know what I mean? Because of certain behaviors and certain ways you have acted. I'm not perfect. I'm going to be real honest with you. In the past, I was very, very toxic, and I was very or my behavior towards other people. I am not toxic. My behavior was. You know what I mean? Like, my behavior was because my inner child's needs, their basic requirements, were not being met. Is in relationships, it definitely came out in relationships, and me wanting to be in a romantic relationship. I would literally chase people down. You know what I mean? Or automatically assume that people did not like me, or automatically assume that I was ugly, or they were trying to use me for sex. I was, and there were times when that really did happen. But I was also coming from a place of nobody wants to spend time with me, nobody loves me, nobody cares about me, and the only way for me to basically disprove that was through romantic relationships. And it took me getting help from a professional therapist, but also doing a lot of spiritual work on my own, and transitioning actually helped with this as well. You know, that was an added bonus to me being my authentic self. Was that there's I don't need their approval. I don't need the approval of someone else in order to feel good about myself. Now, that a romantic relationship is not a guarantee to any one's personal growth. That no one owes me anything, and I don't owe anyone else anything. But it took me a long time, and it was a hard pill to swallow. But it took me healing and doing my inner child work and doing my spiritual work to realize that, to come to that conclusion, and to realize that there is more to this world than allowing myself to be abused by someone else, or being someone else's trauma story, by becoming extremely angry because simply because they didn't want to be around me. You know what I mean? So that's where that's coming from. So my suggestions for the week are, this week I really am encouraging people to ask themselves which of the three types of trauma you resonate with, or they resonate with, and what your experiences were as a child. Was it acute? Was it complex, or was it chronic? And how do they match up with your experiences? Mine was complex. Mine was complex, and there were a lot of things that shaped that helped me come to that conclusion. Also reflect on the stories that you told yourself as a result of that particular form of trauma. It is good to focus on one's story at a time. The one that shaped your perception, that of that certain person, that place or situation that shaped your perception of reality. And mine was I have a few of them, but the one that I have more than a few. But the and like, but the one story that really got me involved my dad leaving. And leaving me, and I felt like he left me in a situation that was very dangerous. And so that shaped my perception of him, by saying he was looking out for himself. He didn't want to be around me, and that's why he left. But that wasn't the case at all. My family was it was really dysfunctional. A lot of the behavior towards among my parents was not healthy. It shaped my perception of marriage, and it shaped my perception of myself. Now I know it has nothing to do with me, but everything to do with them. And ask your inner child to tell that story to you. Ask your inner child to tell the story. And be sure to comfort your inner child and tell them you love them unconditionally, and that everything is going to be okay. That the trauma wasn't their fault. And they are not their trauma, and you are there to protect them. So that is the first half of the show. We ended the first half right now. So thank you so much for listening to that. So this is it. We're going to be doing the Q&A that's coming up shortly after this break. So I'll see you soon. I'll see you in a little bit to answer your questions. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Inner Child Collective. This is Javi. For those who are just tuning in, I forgot to tell you that I'm a psychic, intuitive medium, and author who uses divination and storytelling to help people overcome generational trauma. And one way I do that is by working with inner child energy, and helping people tap into their own inner child in various ways. So I just wanted to let you know that, in case you were like, who is this, right? So for those who don't know, also, this is, again, This is the new Q&A section or portion of the show where I read questions from you, the listener. So it's my way of interacting because I feel like I was not interacting with y'all enough. And also, I feel like this is a way to keep me sharp and to keep me accountable as far as studying, right? So, shout out to the two folks who, sent me questions. There was Blair Voss, who's a friend of mine, and there's Samantha, who are also um, she follows me on Instagram, and she has a business called 108 Mindfully Made. She's really dope. I really like her a lot. I really like her energy. So if you have not, if you're not following her, excuse me, I suggest that you do. So thank you so much to the two of you for sending me questions. I really appreciate it. So let's go on and get to this. So Blair asked me, I'm really curious by what you mean when you talk about inner child. So what I mean by the inner child is the childlike version of ourselves. That's what the inner child is. Basically, the inner child is the childlike version of ourselves that lives within our unconscious mind. They're a separate entity. They become a separate entity once we become an adult, and um, they're the ones who they are our eternal child. That's who we are on the inside eternally. They're the ones who um, they teach us not to take the world seriously. They are our sense of joy, our sense of wonder, our sense of curiosity, excitement. Basically, they keep us from taking the world seriously, um, and they keep us in a sense in a world of play. Right? They are the reasons why we're very playful, very happy, very joyful. Why we get excited when we see new things or experience new things. That is our inner child being tapped into. Okay, so when we as children um, go through any sort of trauma, whether it be acute, complex, or chronic, we're developmentally stunted. Even though we grow up, um, we are developmentally as we grow up and we age chronologically. Um, we end up being emotionally and psychologically stunted, which means that we are on the inside. We are that on an unconscious level. Um, we are that child still. So when we become adults, we think that we have grown up, but we really haven't. We're basically children in adult clothing. Our inner child uses our adult bodies to act out in ways that is not beneficial to them and not beneficial to us. It's actually, in fact, we are reenacting our abuse. They are reenacting the abuse through us because their emotional and psychological needs were not met. They were not heard. They weren't even seen, let alone heard. So what ends up happening is that our life becomes chaotic simply because our inner child is angry, and they feel like they're not being seen or heard. And so this is one of the reasons why inner child energy work is so important, because when you are doing that type of work, you are connecting to your inner child. You're connecting to the little person you used to be, and then you start to reparent. You start to discover what their needs are and what started this roller coaster in regards to your inner child not being seen or heard, or feeling as if they're not being seen or heard. Because remember, their perception of reality is somehow is often colored by the the abuse and neglect that they have gone through. So that's what I mean by the inner child. We all have that inner child, and if we're going to get even more complex, we have a lot of selves based on those inner child the experience, our inner child's experiences, because that inner child becomes an entertainer. We have an inner child, an inner teenager, an inner 20-year-old, 30, whatever. It all depends, right? Um, there each experience that we have gone through leaves an imprint that reminds us of the original incident. So in order, so inner child work also reminds us that those selves are those other inner selves. They also live in our unconscious mind and need to be heard. But to answer your question, the inner child is basically the childlike version of ourselves that live in our unconscious mind that never grows up, but is to be seen and heard on a regular basis. Okay. So thank you for that question, Blair. I really appreciate it. And Samantha of 80108 Mindfully Made, she asks, what do you feel has been the most helpful modality in connecting to your inner child? Hypnosis, meditation, journaling? I am so interested to learn how others help make lasting connection and relationship for healing with the inner child. So that's a really good question, actually. I personally use a lot of writing. I also use um, certain activities, certain types of play, like video games, even though I'm horrible at video games. I use storytelling as another thing, but the modality that I also use is writing, journaling. Um, Journaling is not even journaling, but just writing in general. Writing children's stories is something that I've done, um, or like working with children is another one. Meditation, inner child regression is another one. Like I literally go into a meditative state and tap into my inner child's energy. Um, so that's another. Those are modalities that I have used. But yeah, like writing is very important to me. Meditation is more important. Is very important to me. Play is another activity or modality that I've used. Um, and just like sometimes being around children and just and another thing that I use now that I think about it, another modality that I use is doing, like I said before, doing an activity that helps me imagine me and my inner child playing together. Um, it's on my page, but I love Star Wars. So my inner child, um, we watch Star Wars together. Sometimes sometimes we do that. Another thing that I do is read some of my favorite authors. I read some of my favorite authors as well. So I use a lot of modalities, but the main ones are writing and meditation to answer your question. So yeah, and that's another thing too. Like because of my own trauma, it's sometimes hard for me to like recall because I do so much. So if I feel like I am like stuttering or whatnot, that's why. Um, but those are the modalities that I use, Samantha. Writing and meditation work, um, and engaging in certain activities that I used to do when I was a kid. All right, so that is it as far as the questions. Thank you so much for those questions. Really helpful. Um, so that is the end of this episode for now. Thank you so much for listening to the Inner Child Collective. I really appreciate the support. Um, I really do. And if anything about this episode resonates with you, be sure to download and share it far and wide. Let your friends know that I'm here. Also, if you have any questions about today's topics or anything pertaining to the inner child, you can email me at theinnerchildcollective@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and post your questions in the comment section. Excuse me. And all that info is going to be in the description anyway. So thank you again for listening. I really appreciate your love and support. Until next time, peace.
Once again. Yeah, yeah.